The Earth's biodiversity is declining at rates unprecedented in human history. Plus, a global food crisis as millions are at risk of worsening hunger. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. World leaders have gathered in New York for the opening of the general debate at the United Nations General Assembly. This year's session comes amid ongoing geopolitical tensions, global economic challenges, and dire warnings of looming environmental and human catastrophe. Later, a conversation with the spokesperson for the UN World Food Programme. But we begin with urgent concerns about our planet. I spoke earlier with David Cooper, Acting Executive Secretary of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. David, thanks so much for joining us. The world's biodiversity is declining at alarming rates never seen before. We could lose up to 1 million species within decades. Before we get into what is happening right now, put this in context for us. Why is biodiversity important? Why does it matter?
Well, besides the loss of species that you just mentioned, biodiversity is essential for the functioning of ecosystems, and those ecosystems provide people with essential services, food, clean water, clean air. It also contributes to sequestering carbon and helping to regulate the climate. We've all experienced in the last few weeks and months wildfires, floods, droughts, and of course these are attributed to climate change, but they're also resulting from the fact that we have been degrading our ecosystems, destroying biodiversity, which has increased the risk and the intensity and severity of events like these.
Now, you mentioned that we are degrading our ecosystems. What are the other major factors that's causing this decline?
So there's 5 main direct causes of the loss of biodiversity and the degradation of ecosystems. So one is land use change, and on land that's the largest. So conversion of forests, of wetlands for agriculture, for urban development, for infrastructure, and so on. Secondly, overexploitation, taking too many species, so whether that's overfishing or overhunting or over harvesting of plants, for instance. Thirdly, climate change. Climate change currently is a significant driver of biodiversity loss. If we don't take action, it's going to become the largest driver of biodiversity loss. Fourthly, pollution. Pollution from pesticides, for instance, from too many nutrients, which get then from excess fertilizers that get washed away into our rivers, causing these algal blooms in lakes and in coastal areas. Other sources of pollution like plastic pollution as well, of course. And then finally, invasive alien species. So species coming from other places that, released from their competitors, then outcompete native species, and this can cause problems for biodiversity and also pests and diseases in agriculture.
So 4 of those 5 major reasons that you've given us there are caused by human activity, the 5th one being invasive species. Are there any other factors that contribute to the decline as well?
So the underlying factors actually for all 5 are human-induced. So even the invasive alien species, as we have more travel and trade around the world, we tend to take invasive species with us or allow those connections to happen. So what's driving these 5 direct drivers is overconsumption and unsustainable production patterns. So we need to look at the way we produce food, in particular, to reduce those drivers, and that means increasing the productivity of agriculture, but it also means reducing excessive consumption.
Right. Let's talk about efforts to mitigate the loss that we are seeing. You have said that businesses, particularly large and transnational businesses, need to properly account for their impacts on biodiversity as well as their dependence on it. Talk to us about that.
Yes, so all the activities that we all have impacts on biodiversity, mostly negative, and of course that applies to businesses as well. Um, um, whether that's in food and agriculture, whether that's in construction, whether that's in the energy sector. So the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that was approved last year, it includes a target which calls upon governments to ensure that all large and transnational businesses and financial institutions figure out what are their dependencies on nature and what are their impacts on nature. And once they've done that, they can actually then reduce those negative impacts. So that's, we think, a very important step towards actually then reducing those negative impacts and, incidentally, reducing the negative risks for the businesses and financial institutions themselves.
So it would seem then, David, that much of what you're talking about, these efforts to mitigate the loss that we are seeing, is tied up very closely to the fight to combat climate change.
Absolutely. To a very large extent, biodiversity loss and climate change are two sides of the same coin. As we see increased climate change, we have increased risk of biodiversity loss, both the direct causes by changes in temperature regimes, driving species, distributions one way or another for but also in combination with these other factors that we see, for example, increased wildfire risk and the like. On the other hand, if we can invest in protecting our ecosystems, protecting our biodiversity, we can help mitigate climate change. So we can help keep more carbon in the biosphere, in the forests, in the soils. And we can also improve adaptation to climate change. So if we can maintain or restore wetlands, upland forests, for instance, we reduce the risk from, for example, flooding when it does occur. We also improve the infiltration of water into the soil, and so we also reduce the risk of droughts. So action on biodiversity can very much contribute to the fight against climate change as well.
Right now, last December, 196 countries were at the COP15 Biodiversity Conference, which was chaired by China. They agreed on a framework to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, and that Kunming-Montreal Agreement set 4 global goals for biodiversity protection by 2050 and a plan to protect 30% of the planet's land and sea by 2030. You described it as a, quote, symbolic example of multilateralism at work. What is the main thrust of that? What are the main agreements there?
So you mentioned one target for 2030 to protect 30% of lands and seas. And that is indeed an important part of that agreement. But there's also additional targets, for example, to restore 30% of degraded lands, and to do this in a context of planning the entire landscape and the entire seascape. So the 23 targets that actually support those 4 long-term goals actually cover a whole range of issues. They cover the 5 drivers we talked about a little while ago. They include the target requiring businesses and financial institutions to look at their impacts and how they can reduce them. They include targets to reduce subsidies, harmful subsidies. Currently, we're spending about 10 times more on efforts to destroy biodiversity than to protect it. So one of the major targets of this framework is also to reduce those subsidies. There's also other targets to mobilize resources, financial resources more generally, including for developed countries to mobilize 30 billion by 2030. And cross-cutting all of these our efforts to engage and respect the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. We know that indigenous peoples and local communities are often the best stewards of biodiversity.
You've said that the agreement is, quote, only a document. It is not legally binding. I mean, are you confident that these goals can be reached?
So they can be reached. They're very ambitious. We do know, though, that when governments step up and put in place measures, they do work. Though we did not achieve the earlier Aichi targets, we did make significant progress, and where measures were taken to recover particular species or to restore fishery stocks, for instance, or to invest in reversing deforestation, then we did get results. This time, we hope that with more attention on this issue, with greater resources being mobilized, with much better engagement this time of the business sector and of the financial sector, that we can make progress. Also, in this new agreement, there's a strengthened approach to monitoring progress as we go forward and building in a stock take so that we can assess where we are, what degree of progress are we making towards these targets, where do we need to step up action if we're falling short.
What do these agreements mean for things like agriculture, for infrastructure, for healthcare, for economic growth?
So there's nothing more important for the future of for the future of biodiversity than the way we manage our food and agricultural systems. We need to transform those food and agricultural systems, as was shown through the United Nations Food Systems Summit recently. We need to have a greater focus on nutritious food and perhaps less of a focus on producing commodities that then support meat production. We would need to look at our diets and moderate the amount of meat that is consumed, for instance. But this would be good for people's health as well as good for the environment. And in the end, we cannot see agriculture and biodiversity in opposition because simply agriculture, food production depends absolutely on biodiversity. Obviously, the elements that we eat themselves, the crops and the livestock, are biodiversity. The genetic diversity in those is important for increasing production, for being resilient to pests and diseases. The biodiversity that exists on farm is important in limiting outbreaks of pests and diseases. The pollinators are essential for crop production as well. So agriculture depends absolutely on biodiversity. We need to work together. We need to work together with farmers to improve the sustainability and the productivity of agriculture. Biodiversity is also essential for health. Aside from providing good nutrition, our immune systems depend on our relationship with biodiversity. As we destroy ecosystems, as we encroach into ecosystems, we increase the risk of disease emergence, zoonotic disease emergence, and the risk of pandemics. So the conservation of biodiversity is also an essential part of our efforts to prevent future pandemics.
China has made significant progress in meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm talking here about eliminating poverty, protecting the marine environment, combating climate change, and conserving land ecosystems. How do you see China's role as the signatories move forward to implementing the goals that we've been talking about?
Yeah, indeed, as you say, China's made great steps forward in expanding its protected areas, through its red line system, protecting critical ecosystems that are important for services provided to people. And it has also played a critical role in the negotiations, the role of the Chinese presidency in ensuring that we had a strong agreement that could be supported by all the countries in Montreal last December was critical to the success of that meeting. And of course, now China has the presidency of the convention, of the Conference of Parties, for a 2-year period leading up to October 2024, and is continuing to champion implementation now of this important framework. And we only have less than 7 years to achieve these 2030 targets. So this early efforts is to create the momentum we need to implement the framework is also important.
As you say, less than 7 years. Developed countries have the means to implement this agreement, but what about developing countries? How does one ensure that their interests are looked after and that there will be a sort of equitable sharing of the benefits?
So, yes, I mean, obviously developed countries are in a better resource, but even developed countries need to invest much more in biodiversity than they are currently, and they need to reduce negative subsidies, perverse subsidies on biodiversity. But developing countries will need access to a lot more finance, and some of that will have to be raised domestically, but some of it also has to come through international cooperation. The Kunming-Montreal framework sets a target of developed countries providing to developing countries 20 billion by 2025 and $30 billion by 2030. We will also need to see how we can raise more funds through the private sector, through the multilateral development banks going forward. And we also need to think how we can strengthen technical and scientific collaboration among countries, between developed and developing countries, but also among developing countries, sharing experiences of what works, what policy measures are successful, and how can they perhaps inform the development of policies in other developing countries.
Dr. David Cooper, thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you so much.
Next, according to the United Nations, as many as 783 million people faced hunger around the world last year. Conflict continues to be the biggest driving force behind food insecurity. The climate crisis and economic shocks have also left millions of people wondering where their next meal will come from. My colleague Mike Walter spoke with Shaza Mogharabi, the spokesperson for the United Nations World Food Programme, about the critical issues at stake.
The world is dealing with a massive crisis at the moment, and one of the key messages that we're bringing to UNGA this year is the record level of hunger. Hunger rates have soared due to multiple factors. That includes conflict, climate change. The regularity of climate extremes is becoming more and more frequent. We have droughts, floods, natural disasters. So all that has led to hunger rates rising to record levels. And at the same time, we are dealing with a very crippling funding crisis of a historic proportion. And this is making people, suffer the consequences. We're already seeing the consequences on the ground, but the consequences of what may happen in the future with cuts is really, really bad. So our key message is that we need everyone to step up and support and help organizations like WFP reach the people that it needs to help and support and that needs our help.
And on the ground, you mentioned, we're seeing it on the ground. And recently, I know I read that in Afghanistan, now it's a choice between serving the hungry and the starving. I mean, the budget shortfall is that stark. Can you talk to us about, people who go into your line of work, it's this commitment to help, to be kind of handcuffed in that way has got to be very difficult.
That's exactly it, Mike. I mean, we are being put in a very horrible situation where whatever funds we get, we are directing that to the people who are starving. But the consequences of that is that people who are already suffering from hunger are slipping deeper into more acute and severe levels of hunger. So these cuts have severe consequences. Some of them are very life-threatening. And at the same time, we don't have the time of the world to act. We need urgent funding and resources as soon as possible. And the problem as well is that apart from, saving lives, the issue is that all the achievements that were done in the past few years fighting hunger, those are at risk of being reversed. So this is what we're talking about when it comes to the impact of these funding shortfalls on the livelihoods of people.
And I think about what you've been talking about, with the issues of drought and these climate events that we're seeing everywhere, which kind of dominate the news cycle. And people tend to forget that it's not just Afghanistan. I heard a journalist today, in fact, talking about returning from the DRC and the hunger that he's seeing there. We think about Yemen, we think about Haiti, other places like Sudan. It's like actually the little kid trying to put a finger in the hole in the dike and another one springs up somewhere else. You've got major issues out there.
Exactly. And these are the issues that are happening and we're hearing about in the news. And in some cases, some of them, recent example being Sudan, we don't hear about Sudan as much in the news. But you've got the protracted crisis, for example, Syria. We started implementing cuts inside Syria. The situation was already bad. Food prices have skyrocketed. So average people are not being able, the average salary is not able to keep up with all these changes and the developments. And then we had refugees, for example, Syrian refugees in Jordan. We were forced to cut assistance to them. So it's all over, continents, and we're really concerned about that because, some of these crises, such as the Syrian crisis, just because it's been happening for a really long while, does not mean that people have actually were able to cope or they're still not in need of assistance. It's still critical. But again, this is what we have. These are the resources that we have, and we're forced to take these painful decisions. The thing is, what I also want to emphasize is that we do have a plan. It's not that WFP doesn't have, we do have a plan. What we need is the resources and, of course, in many cases, access to reach the people who need our support.
Talking about resources, we were talking about Afghanistan just a moment ago. China is among the UN member countries that has sent food to Afghanistan. A delivery in July included wheat, flour, and a number of other staples, enough to support about 70,000 people for 2 months. Again, clearly that's not enough, the way you just described it. But can you talk to us about China's contributions thus far?
I think China's contributions has been very generous and helpful to WFP, as with other donors. But I think with these exceptional circumstances, we need all partners, all donors to really help us get through this crisis for the sake of the people who are bearing the brunt of this crisis. And we're talking about average women, children, civilians, elderly. These people are paying the ultimate price, and we need all our traditional partners to step up, but we also need new partners to come in. And there's different ways to contribute. Of course, resources and funds is very critical. It's very important. There's like this fire that's happening. So the first thing when you do, when there's a fire in the home, you try to put out that fire and prevent the loss of life through interventions. However, what we also need is partnerships. We need partnerships, and China can be a great example of a partnership. There's been a lot of success in eradicating poverty in areas. So we need partners and donor governments and private sector to come join hands with WFP to find solutions, innovative solutions to some of the crises and the chronic problems that we're facing. I mean, just to kind of emphasize that point, WFP has a history and a track record of using innovative solutions and partnering with governments and the private sector to find those solutions to deal with today's problems, whether it's flawed food systems or making our humanitarian delivery much more efficient and streamlined.
And I was just going to say the WFP has been around for a while, but I don't think it's ever faced this triple whammy that we've seen out there. You know, there's always been conflicts, but now you're looking at the climate crisis and also COVID, all of these combining to create this stew that's been really difficult to combat. Can you talk to us about just how tough that's been?
It's been very challenging. Obviously, I mean, you've mentioned the main factors that are the root causes for the hunger crisis that we're facing today. On top of that, you've got the war in Ukraine. You know, we're talking about a conflict that is between two of the biggest players in food security around the world. So a lot of our wheat used to be procured from Ukraine, a lot of the fertilizers from Russia, and we're one of the largest procurers worldwide. For those who are not so familiar with WFP, we operate in over 120 countries and territories. So we have a huge operational presence. And we were also faced with the same crisis of high food prices. The cost of our procurement of goods, I believe, reached up to or increased 40% between 2019 and 2023. So that is also an issue that we're facing as one of the biggest procurers of goods and services, particularly in the food sector. So it's been really tough, but we cannot lose hope. We cannot let the millions and millions of people who depend on our support, and we continue to call on the international community to come in and step up to support us, whether it's donor governments, the non-traditional donor governments, or even, as I said, the private sector and individuals. I think every single dollar counts. And right now, our humanitarian dollar is really being stretched to the limit and a breaking point.
You said can't lose hope. Does this kind of redouble your efforts in a sense? Do you sit there and just kind of look at different methods like how can we gin things up?
Absolutely, in terms of the methods and the mechanisms. And one thing is that the way we provide assistance is really diverse. It really fits the context. So depending on the context that we're working on, this is where WFP intervenes and creates a program. So, for example, if communities were hit by a natural disaster and they don't have access to markets, then WFP sets up food distribution points where they are and distributes the food. And this is the case in many refugee influx contexts or, host countries receiving refugees, where markets are fully functional. This is where we provide them with cash assistance so that they could have more of a choice on the kinds of food that suits them and their families. It's also a win-win situation because most of the host countries that we see of massive, where they receive massive waves of refugees, are countries that they typically don't have a very strong economy. They were just getting by, before something like that will have an impact on their economy comes. So with cash assistance, we're also injecting money into these host countries. Classic example is the Syrian refugee crisis in Jordan, the refugee influx in Lebanon, and the neighboring countries. So it really depends on the context. We were one of the first people to implement a blockchain technology in the way we provide assistance. So yeah, there's various ways to do so, and we're working with a multitude of partners to achieve the goal that we want to achieve.
My thanks to my colleague Mike Walter, and that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.